They said no one could stand within 10 feet of the sealed chamber without feeling the air change, as if the world itself hesitated before the door. And on the night Emily Carter arrived at Blackwood Citadel, she felt that hesitation press against her chest like a warning she could not ignore. The stone halls were cold and endless, lit by dim iron lamps that flickered like they were afraid to stay bright for too long. And every step she took echoed with the quiet certainty that she was not supposed to be here. 2 guards walked behind her without speaking, their presence less like protection and more like a reminder that turning back was no longer an option. "You understand the rules," one of them finally said, voice low and controlled. "No one enters the beast chamber unless authorized, and no one stays if they lose control of themselves." Emily did not answer immediately. Her hands tightened around the edge of her sleeve. She was not a warrior, not someone trained for court, politics, or pack dominance. She was an Omega who had spent most of her life being overlooked. Yet something in the silence ahead of her felt heavier than fear. It felt like recognition waiting to happen. When they reached the final corridor, the guard stopped, and the air itself seemed to collapse inward. The door before them was massive, reinforced with black iron and carved with ancient sigils that pulsed faintly, as if alive. One guard placed a key into the lock, but hesitated. "Whatever you hear inside, do not approach him unless he responds to your voice," he said, and there was something in his tone that sounded less like instruction and more like survival advice. The door opened slowly, releasing a breath of air that was warm and strangely unstable, and Emily stepped forward into the chamber, where light did not behave normally. Shadows stretched too far, and in the center of the room something large sat restrained by luminous chains that shimmered like woven starlight. At first, she could not tell if it was man or beast, only that it moved with restrained tension, like a storm forced into a single body. Its breathing was uneven, echoing softly through the chamber, as if the walls themselves were listening. "You shouldn't be here," one of the guards whispered behind her, but Emily did not turn back, because in that moment she felt something she could not explain, not fear, not danger, but a quiet pull, like an invisible thread tightening around her heart. She took one step closer, then another, until the faint glow of the chains revealed a face beneath the shifting shadows, sharp, distant, human in form, yet burdened by something far greater than humanity should carry. And though his eyes were closed, she felt them as if they were already aware of her presence. "Ethan Blackwood," one guard muttered behind her in disbelief, as if saying the name aloud could break the fragile balance of the room. Emily did not know the stories fully, only fragments whispered through the pack about a king who had lost control of something within himself, something no healer had ever reached. Yet standing there, she did not see a monster. She saw a man trapped in silence so deep. It had become its own kind of prison. Slowly, against every warning she had been given, Emily lifted her hand, and the moment her fingers brushed the faint glow of the barrier around him, the air shifted, not violently, but profoundly, like the world had just recognized a truth it had been waiting for. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Blackwood's eyes opened, meeting hers as if the distance between curse and cure had just collapsed into a single impossible breath. The moment her fingers touched the faint barrier of light, the entire chamber seemed to inhale at once, as if the world itself had been waiting for permission to respond. And Emily Carter felt a surge of warmth move through her arm that was not fire and not electricity, but something far more unsettling in its gentleness. Like recognition without explanation, Ethan Blackwood did not move. Yet the chains around him shimmered with a subtle instability, as though they were no longer certain of their purpose. His eyes remained locked on hers, and in that silence she realized he was not simply watching her. He was assessing her presence the way a storm recognizes the shore it has never touched before. Behind her, one of the guards took a cautious step forward but stopped when the air shifted again. Heavier now, more focused, Emily slowly withdrew her hand from the barrier. Yet the feeling did not leave her. It lingered in her chest like a pulse that did not belong to her alone. "Step back," a guard whispered urgently, but his voice sounded distant, as if even sound was being softened by something unseen. Ethan's head tilted slightly, a movement so subtle it could have been mistaken for instinct rather than intention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that filled every corner of the chamber, roughened by strain yet unmistakably human. "You are not supposed to be able to stand there," he said, and the words were not a warning, but a statement of disbelief. Emily swallowed, forcing herself to remain steady, though every instinct told her to retreat. Yet something deeper than instinct kept her rooted in place. "Neither are you," she replied before she could reconsider, and for the first time the tension in the room shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, like a thread being pulled tighter between two distant points. Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that the atmosphere around him seemed to bend, as if a long-forgotten memory had briefly surfaced beneath the weight of his restraint. The luminous chains flickered again, and this time Emily noticed they were not simply restraining him physically, but reacting to him, stabilizing something that was constantly on the edge of breaking. "They told me no one would come close," Ethan said quietly, as though testing the shape of his own words. Emily glanced toward the guards, but they were frozen, uncertain whether they were witnessing a threat or something far more complicated. She took a cautious step forward, not toward him this time, but toward understanding. "They also told me no one survives this room," she said softly, her voice steady despite the unease rising in her chest. Ethan's gaze sharpened, and for a brief moment the air between them felt thinner, charged with an unspoken force neither of them fully understood. "And yet you are still breathing," he replied, as if that fact alone contradicted everything he had been taught to believe. Emily felt her heartbeat slow instead of quicken, which frightened her more than fear itself, because nothing about this moment followed the rules she had been taught about power, danger, or distance. Ethan shifted slightly within the restraints, not struggling, but reacting as though something within him had begun to awaken in response to her presence. The chamber lights dimmed and brightened in uneven rhythm, and Emily realized with quiet certainty that she was no longer just standing in a guarded room. She was standing at the edge of something that had been dormant for far too long, and whatever Ethan Blackwood was becoming in this moment, it was no longer something that could remain hidden. The silence inside the chamber did not break when Ethan Blackwood spoke again. Instead, it deepened, as if the very walls were listening more carefully than the guards standing behind Emily Carter. And for a moment, she became aware of something unsettlingly precise in the way his gaze held her, not like an attack, not like a threat, but like a question that had been waiting for far too long to be asked. The faint glow of the restraints around him flickered again, not violently, but rhythmically, as though responding to an unseen pulse that matched neither the room nor the people inside it. Emily felt her fingers curl slightly at her sides, not from fear alone, but from a growing awareness that something inside this chamber was changing shape around her presence. "You are not afraid," Ethan said slowly, and this time there was something quieter beneath his voice, something almost uncertain. Emily hesitated before answering, because the truth was not that she was fearless, but that fear itself had become difficult to define in the space between them. "I am afraid," she said honestly, but not in the way I expected. The words seemed to settle into the air and remain there longer than sound should, and Ethan's expression shifted again, subtle but distinct, like a crack forming in something long sealed. Behind her, one of the guards whispered that they should end the interaction immediately. Yet, neither guard moved forward, as if the chamber itself had imposed a silent rule of stillness. Ethan lowered his head slightly, his breathing uneven but no longer purely unstable. "No one speaks to me like that," he said, not as a complaint, but as a fact he was rediscovering. Emily took a careful step closer, stopping just outside the faint shimmer of the barrier that separated him from the rest of the chamber. And as she did, the luminous chains reacted again, this time with a soft wave of brightness that traveled along their length like a heartbeat finding rhythm. "Maybe no one ever had to," she replied. And for the first time Ethan's eyes narrowed not with hostility, but with focus, as if trying to determine whether she was real or simply another illusion his condition had created. The temperature in the room shifted slightly, warm air replacing the earlier cold, and Emily noticed the guards exchanging uneasy glances. Ethan's voice dropped lower, roughened by restraint yet carrying an undeniable clarity. "If you take one more step, you will cross a threshold that cannot be undone," he said, and though the warning was clear, it lacked the certainty of command. as if even he was no longer sure of the boundaries he was describing. Emily looked at him steadily, her heartbeat steadying instead of racing, and for reasons she could not articulate. She understood that whatever stood before her was not merely a creature contained by magic or metal, but a man suspended between control and collapse. "Maybe that threshold is already behind me," she said softly, and at that exact moment the chamber responded, not with destruction, but with resonance, as if her words had aligned with something ancient and dormant within Ethan himself. His breath caught, and the faint glow around his form intensified for a fraction of a second before stabilizing again. The guards finally stepped forward as if reacting to an invisible signal, but Ethan raised one hand slightly, not in aggression, but in silent refusal, and they stopped instantly. Emily realized then that the balance of authority in the room had shifted without permission, and at the center of it all, Ethan Blackwood stood no longer as a sealed curse or a broken king, but as something dangerously close to awakening. The moment Ethan Blackwood raised his hand, the chamber did not obey silence. It obeyed him, and that realization alone sent a subtle shift through the air that Emily Carter could feel in her chest like a distant pressure changing direction. The guards who had stepped forward froze again, not because they were commanded, but because something in the room no longer recognized their authority as stable. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on Emily, but now there was something different inside that gaze. Not just awareness, but recognition forming layer by layer, as if a memory buried under years of control had begun to surface. "This should not be happening," one of the guards said under his breath, yet his voice lacked conviction, as though he was describing a rule that no longer applied. Emily did not move closer or farther. She simply remained where she was, anchored by a feeling she could not explain. A strange alignment between her presence and the instability around Ethan. The faint, luminous chains that bound him began to shift again, their glow no longer uniform, now pulsing in uneven patterns that seemed to mirror Ethan's breathing, slower, deeper, less fractured than before. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, the weight in the chamber felt different, as if something within him had stepped 1 inch closer to the surface. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly, not accusing, not demanding, but genuinely trying to understand the phenomenon standing before him. Emily's throat tightened slightly, because she realized she did not have a scientific answer, or a political answer, or even a rational one. She only had what she felt, and what she felt was that the distance between them was not physical, but something far more delicate. "I am not doing anything," she said, and her voice remained steady despite the uncertainty behind it. Ethan's expression tightened for a brief second, then softened in a way that made the air itself feel less heavy, as if tension had found a temporary place to rest. The guards exchanged another look, but no one dared interrupt. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, and for the first time the intensity surrounding him was not directed outward, but inward, as though he was listening to something beneath his own thoughts. "Then why does it stop?" he said quietly, almost to himself, and the question carried a weight that felt older than the room they stood in. Emily hesitated, then took a single step closer, slow and deliberate, and nothing broke. Nothing resisted. Instead, the luminous chains responded with a faint harmonic glow, as if acknowledging proximity rather than rejecting it. Ethan's breathing changed again, but this time it was not erratic. It was measured, controlled in a way that suggested he was remembering control rather than fighting for it. "You are not like the others," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a depth that neither of them fully understood yet. Emily felt something shift inside her at that statement. Not pride, not fear, but the unsettling awareness that she had become part of a pattern she did not recognize. Behind her, one of the guards whispered that the containment readings were fluctuating beyond expected limits, but the words felt distant, almost irrelevant now, because Ethan Blackwood was no longer reacting like a sealed entity under observation. He was reacting like someone who had found a fixed point in a collapsing world, and that point was standing directly in front of him. The air inside the chamber felt different now, not because it had changed physically, but because it no longer reacted to fear alone, and Emily Carter could sense that subtle difference in the way Ethan Blackwood watched her, as if he was no longer trying to determine what she was, but instead trying to understand what she made possible. The luminous chains around him continued their slow, unstable rhythm. Yet the instability was no longer chaotic. It resembled something closer to adjustment, like a broken system attempting to recalibrate around an unexpected constant. Ethan's voice came again, lower this time, not strained, but thoughtful. "Every person who has stood in this room before you tried to fix me," he said, and the words carried no bitterness, only observation. Emily did not respond immediately because she could feel the weight behind what he was saying, as if countless unseen attempts had shaped the space around them long before her arrival. Behind her, the guards remained still, their presence now feeling more like distant witnesses than active participants. Emily took another careful step forward, stopping just within a few feet of the luminous boundary, close enough now that she could see the fine details in the light. Patterns around him. They were not random. They were responding in sequence, like an unfamiliar language trying to form itself in real time. "I am not trying to fix you," she said softly, and the honesty of it seemed to settle into the chamber more deeply than any command or instruction could have. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly at those words, and for a moment he looked away from her, as if the concept itself required distance to process. "Then why are you here?" he asked, and this time the question carried less resistance and more curiosity. Emily paused, because the answer was not simple. She had not been sent to heal, or to study, or to control. She had been sent because no one expected her presence to matter. And yet here, she stood at the center of something that had already begun to shift because of it. "I think I was brought here because I was not supposed to matter," she said carefully. "And somehow that is what makes me different." The moment those words left her mouth, the chains reacted again. But this time the response was immediate and synchronized, their glow stabilizing for a fraction of a second before spreading evenly across their structure. Ethan's breath caught slightly, not in pain, but in recognition of change. He looked down at his hands as if noticing them differently for the first time, then slowly lifted his gaze back to her. "When you are near," he said, and there was a pause as if he was searching for the correct way to describe something that defied his understanding. "The noise stops." Emily felt a quiet tension settle in her chest at that statement, because she realized he was not referring to sound, but to something internal, something unstable that had likely defined his existence for a long time. The guards behind her shifted slightly, one of them speaking in a low voice about containment fluctuations continuing to rise, but the words felt increasingly distant. Ethan took a slow breath, deeper than before, and the chamber responded again, not with pressure, but with balance, as though it was learning a new equilibrium through proximity alone. "Stay where you are," he said quietly, not as a command, but as a request shaped by uncertainty. And Emily understood in that moment that whatever stood before her was no longer simply contained. It was listening, adapting, and remembering what it meant to be near something that did not fear it. The moment Ethan Blackwood spoke those words, the chamber seemed to adjust itself again, not violently, not suddenly, but with a slow and deliberate recalibration, as if the space around him had begun to recognize a new pattern of stability forming through Emily Carter's presence. She remained still where she stood, though every instinct in her body urged caution, not because she felt danger, but because she felt significance building in a way she did not yet understand. Ethan's gaze did not leave her now, and it carried a strange duality, as if part of him was still fighting something internal, while another part was learning how to exist without resistance for the first time in what felt like years. The luminous chains surrounding him dimmed and brightened in soft intervals, no longer erratic, now resembling a controlled pulse that echoed faintly with his breathing. Emily noticed the change immediately, not because she was told, but because the atmosphere itself had become less oppressive. "When you stay still," Ethan said slowly, his voice quieter than before, "everything inside me stops moving against itself." Emily absorbed the words without interruption, understanding that he was not speaking in metaphor, but in lived experience. Behind her the guards exchanged another uneasy glance, but neither moved forward, as if afraid that even a small interruption might undo whatever fragile balance had formed. Emily took a slow breath and allowed herself to remain present in the moment rather than retreating from it. "What do you feel when I am close?" she asked carefully, not as an observer, but as someone trying to map the edges of a reality that did not follow known rules. Ethan hesitated, and for the first time there was a visible conflict in his expression, not of aggression, but of uncertainty, as if naming the sensation itself required confronting something long suppressed. "It is quiet," he finally said, "but not empty. It is as if something that has been breaking for a long time finally remembers how to hold its shape." Emily felt a subtle tightening in her chest at those words, because they did not sound like a condition or a curse. They sounded like recognition returning after long absence. The light around the chains steadied further, and a faint resonance passed through the chamber floor, so subtle it was almost imagined. Ethan lowered his head slightly, then lifted it again, studying her with renewed focus. "You are not trained," he said, as if confirming a fact that confused him. Emily gave a slight nod, not attempting to pretend otherwise. "No," she replied. "I was never meant to be here." Ethan processed this quietly, and for a brief moment the space between them felt less like separation and more like alignment waiting to complete itself. The guards behind her finally spoke in low tones about containment protocols showing instability in reverse, but their words lacked urgency now, replaced instead with hesitation. As if their understanding of the situation was no longer sufficient, Ethan took a step forward within the restraints, not toward escape, but toward proximity, and the chains responded not with resistance, but with a softened glow that suggested adaptation rather than control. Emily did not step back, and in that stillness something unspoken passed between them, not a command, not a bond, but the earliest formation of understanding between two presences that should not have been able to affect each other, and yet were reshaping the boundaries of what the chamber itself had been built to contain. The chamber no longer felt like a place built for containment, it felt like a space quietly forgetting its original purpose, as if every rule that once governed its structure was slowly being rewritten by the presence of Emily Carter and the shifting state of Ethan Blackwood. The guards stood further back now without being ordered to move, their silence heavier than before because it was no longer rooted in control but in uncertainty. Ethan remained within the luminous restraints, yet the glow around them had softened into a steady rhythm that mirrored a calm he had not experienced in a long time. His eyes stayed fixed on Emily, not with demand or confusion now, but with a growing clarity that made his expression appear almost human in a way that felt newly remembered rather than newly created. "You are changing something here," he said quietly, and the words carried no accusation, only observation shaped by curiosity. Emily felt the weight of that statement settle between them because she had begun to sense it as well, though she could not define what was changing or how. Deeply it reached beyond the visible chamber. "I am not trying to change anything," she replied, and her voice remained steady despite the complexity of what she was feeling. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then shifted his stance slightly, and the chains responded again, not tightening, not resisting, but adjusting as if recalibrating their function around his movement. "Everything I have ever known reacts to me with resistance," he said slowly. "But you do not." Emily took another small step forward, stopping just at the edge of the faint luminous boundary, and instead of instability there was balance, a subtle harmony forming where tension had once dominated. Behind her, one of the guards whispered that the readings were no longer fluctuating in expected danger patterns, but stabilizing in unfamiliar formations. Yet no one interrupted. Ethan's gaze softened slightly as if he was testing the feeling of being seen without consequence. "When I lose control," he continued, "there is nothing left that responds with calm. Everything breaks or retreats." Emily listened without speaking, because she understood now that he was not describing power, but isolation, a long-standing state of existence where reaction had always meant escalation or withdrawal. She raised her hand slowly, not touching him, but holding it near the boundary of light, and the chamber responded again with a subtle pulse that moved through the air like a shared breath. Ethan's eyes followed the motion, and for the first time there was something like hesitation in him, not fear, but the awareness of possibility. "I do not know what you are," he admitted quietly, and the honesty of it carried more weight than any command he had given before. Emily met his gaze directly, and in that exchange something unspoken settled into place, not resolution, but recognition of a path neither of them had expected. The chains around him glowed evenly now, no longer flickering, no longer unstable, and the chamber that had once been designed to suppress him now seemed to be listening instead, as if waiting for the next change to confirm whether control or connection would define what came next. The chamber had reached a state that no longer felt like instability, but like transformation, as if every unseen force inside it had begun to reorganize itself around a single undeniable truth. And Emily Carter could feel that shift in the way the air no longer pressed against her, but instead moved with her presence. Ethan Blackwood stood within the luminous restraints. Yet even the concept of restraint seemed less absolute now, the glow around the chains steady and calm, like a system that had stopped resisting and started adapting. His eyes remained locked on Emily, and there was a depth in his expression that no longer carried confusion alone, but something closer to understanding forming slowly through layers of forgotten control. "Everything in this place was designed to contain me," he said quietly, his voice no longer strained but reflective. "But it never accounted for you." Emily did not respond immediately, because the words carried a weight that extended beyond the chamber itself, as if he was not only describing his condition but the logic of an entire system that had failed to predict her presence. Behind her the guards stood frozen, their earlier hesitation now replaced with silence that felt heavier than command. Ethan shifted slightly, and the chains responded without tension, their glow maintaining perfect balance as if learning to exist without correction. "When you first touched the barrier," he continued, "something inside me stopped reacting the way it always has." Emily felt her heartbeat steady rather than accelerate, which unsettled her more than fear ever could, because everything about this moment defied expectation without collapsing into chaos. She raised her hand, again slowly, not touching anything, but simply existing within proximity, and the chamber responded with a subtle wave of synchronized light that moved across the restraints like a shared breath between two unstable states finding alignment. Ethan's gaze softened further, and for a brief moment, he looked away as if testing the sensation of silence within himself. "It is not control," he said after a pause. "It is absence of conflict." Emily absorbed the meaning carefully, realizing he was describing a condition where internal opposition no longer fractured his awareness, where presence did not trigger collapse but coherence. She took one step closer, now close enough that the boundary of light between them felt less like separation and more like threshold. Ethan did not move back, and neither did the chains tighten. Instead, they maintained their steady glow, as if confirming stability rather than enforcing restriction. One of the guards whispered that the containment systems were no longer registering threat response, but adaptive equilibrium. Yet even that observation sounded uncertain, as if their instruments were reporting something they were not designed to interpret. Ethan lowered his head slightly, then looked back at Emily with a clarity that felt newly formed rather than recovered. "If this continues," he said quietly, "I do not know what I will become." And there was no fear in the statement, only recognition of change that had already begun. Emily met his gaze without hesitation, and in that moment the chamber no longer felt like a place built to imprison or observe, but like a space standing at the edge of rewriting its own rules, waiting for whichever truth would define what came next. The chamber no longer behaved like a structure built from stone and containment systems. It now felt like a living equation rewriting itself in real time, and Emily Carter could sense that every subtle shift in the air was no longer reacting to Ethan Blackwood alone, but to the connection forming between them. The luminous restraints that had once defined his limits now pulsed with a steady and unified rhythm, as if they had accepted a new pattern of balance that no longer required force to maintain. Ethan stood still, yet stillness no longer looked like imprisonment. It looked like focus, like a man listening to something deeper than the world around him. His gaze remained on Emily, but now there was no confusion left in it, only clarity slowly settling into place like fragments finding alignment after years of separation. "Something is changing," he said quietly, and this time the words carried acceptance rather than resistance. Emily felt it too, not as an idea, but as a reality she could not ignore. The air between them no longer felt unstable. It felt calibrated, as if her presence had become a stabilizing constant within a system that had never known equilibrium. Behind her, the guards finally moved, but not forward. Instead, they stepped back slightly, consulting devices that flickered with readings no longer matching any known containment protocol. Their voices were low, uncertain, describing synchronization where there had once been volatility. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, then exhaled slowly, and the chamber responded in kind, the glow of the restraints dimming just slightly as though acknowledging a shift in internal state. "I can feel it," he said. "The conflict is no longer dividing me." Emily took a careful breath, realizing that what she was witnessing was not the suppression of something dangerous, but the harmonization of something fractured. She stepped closer again, now within only a few feet of him, and instead of resistance, the chamber responded with a calm resonance that seemed to extend outward in soft waves. Ethan's head lifted slightly, and for the first time there was no distance in his expression, only presence. "You are not triggering it," he said. "You are aligning it." Emily did not fully understand the mechanics of what he meant, but she understood the truth beneath it, that her presence did not provoke instability. It resolved it. The luminous chains around him began to loosen not through force, but through structural deactivation, each link dimming as though its purpose had quietly concluded. One by one, they faded into soft light until they were no longer restraints, but faint traces of energy dissolving into the air. Ethan remained standing, no longer bound. Yet he did not move, as if uncertain whether movement itself would disrupt what had just formed. The chamber lights stabilized into a calm and even illumination, removing the sense of pressure that had defined the space from the beginning. One of the guards finally spoke, his voice cautious and almost disbelieving as he reported that containment status had shifted from critical to neutral without intervention. But even that language felt insufficient to describe what had occurred. Ethan turned slightly toward Emily, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer fragmented by control or instability. It was steady, grounded, and undeniably present. "I do not know what I am becoming," he said, "but I know it is no longer something I am facing alone." Emily met his gaze without hesitation, and in that exchange there was no command, no fear, only the quiet formation of something neither of them had been prepared to name. As the chamber settled into complete silence for the first time, it no longer felt like a prison or a test, but like the beginning of a system that had finally discovered balance through connection rather than control.